All right, welcome to the Latest.com show. I'm Igor Deris. Joining me from Toronto, he's a staff writer at Latest.com and a contributor at Issue Hawk, our senior Canadian correspondent, Eric Carrier. And he's a 24-year veteran of the U.S. State Department and the author of We Meant Well, How I Helped Lose the Battle for the Hearts and Minds of the Iraqi People from New York, Peter Van Buren. This was a shit week to be a journalist. You know, it was just sad and horrific seeing what happened in Paris on Friday. And then it was just equally as disgusting seeing some of the reactions that we've seen here in the U.S. and also in Europe. You know, basically blaming the attack on people fleeing the same thing that we just saw in Paris, except virtually on a daily basis. Now, Peter, this was an attack that was carried out by citizens of France and Belgium. Why aren't we banning Belgian people from states like some of these governors are trying to ban Syrian refugees?
Well, it's a funny thing, and there's some historical context for this. On 9/11, a group of hijackers, almost all of whom were Saudis, who were funded by the Saudi government in large part, and who had lived in Germany before they came to America, attacked the United States, and so we bombed Afghanistan. You know, there's a tendency to sort of take these things and exploit them the way that a government wants to exploit them. I mean, with no disrespect to the dead in Paris, they become something of a neutral item. And the terrorists on one side make of the event what they wish, and then the government on the other side makes of the event what they wish. And so, unfortunately, rather than focusing on the realities of this, including the irony that the attackers in Paris who've been identified are all EU residents, we make it into what we want to make it into, which is, we should drop more bombs on Syria.
You know, we've seen more than 30 states now try to go ahead and ban Syrian refugees. Eric, can any governor actually enforce this type of law?
Nope. I mean, when the federal government comes down and accepts the Syrian refugees, they can have them placed wherever they want to. The governors can make it stink all they want, but it would go to a Supreme Court case if ever, and they're obviously going to rule in favor of human rights on almost every platform. And to build on what Peter said, not necessarily related to what you asked me, but it does aggravate me when we see something like this happen and then the mainstream politics, like in this case the Republicans, they seem to have this tendency to group all Muslims into one category, to assume that every country in the Middle East is one giant country working against the U.S. And that's not how it works. It would be the same logic if we were to approach Asia and say that all Asians are just Asian. It doesn't work like that. You have to look at the specific cultures within to understand what's going on and the different rivalries between the different cultures. And I think that gets largely ignored when we analyze the Middle East.
I mean, imagine if after Pearl Harbor, the United States declared war on Buddhism, because it's roughly
Shinto.
the same kind. Well, yeah, Shinto is, we could get both of them, but Shinto actually is somewhat confined to Japan. So it's the idea that Eric said that this is all somehow connected. Back to the governor thing, of course, every one of those governors, first of all, knew that they had no power to ban a particular group of people from living in their state. I mean, you know, other than trying to drive into Alabama with a U-Haul truck with New York plates, you know, you can just move around the United States the way you want. There's no rules that say this person can live in Alabama and this person can live in Kentucky. It's absolutely ridiculous. And the same thing goes for people who are applying for any benefits, who are signing up for any services that are provided by the state. So the thing that makes what we saw this week doubly bad is not only that the governors felt a need to say such a bigoted, hateful thing, but they said it knowing absolutely that it was not true.
No, you know, it's really amazing. Like, you have more than 30 states looking to ban refugees. And what does it say about our government, you know, when the response is to try and ban refugees fleeing a war? While France, where these heinous attacks just happened, just announced today that they're bringing in more 30,000 refugees, even more than they agreed to earlier in the fall, Eric.
If I can interject, not only refugees fleeing a war, but more than likely a war that the Americans caused. So here they go in, they cause something, and now they don't want to help the people that are displaced as a result of it. And yeah, it's quite sickening. I think more than anything, most of the governors are making these stances to try to look tough on immigration, because right now that's the hot topic. and any governor that maybe wants to jockey for, an advancement in his political career later on can point back and say, hey, when the Paris attacks happened, I was tough on immigration. I didn't give them any leeway. And I think that's where a lot of them are trying to go with this. And it's
that's a good point. But, the president of France, Francois Hollande, he's been trying to act tough, and, he ramped up the attacks on Syria. But at the same time, he goes and says, well, we're going to bring in 30,000 new Syrian refugees over the next 30 years. Peter, where's the disconnect in power here?
I think the disconnect is in our bigoted way of doing business, where our politicians feel compelled to manipulate the ignorant masses the way that they do. It's a simple extension of the other horrific things that people say in order to get elected here. That the gays are coming for your children, or that if we institute responsible gun control, only criminals will have guns, or the endless panic over drugs. That if we allow people to smoke marijuana, then the whole country is going to go to hell, and pretty soon 8-year-olds are going to be shooting up heroin at the mosque. This kind of fear mongering is so built into our politics now. You need only watch the next set of debates. The Democrats, I think, are just slightly more articulate about it and are a little more comfortable using code words. Hillary Clinton will not come out and say we should close the mosques the way Donald Trump did this week. But she'll still talk about the need to vet refugees carefully, or to consider the options in the war in Syria. And I think these are sort of fuzzier code words for a lot of the things that the Republicans now apparently have found themselves able to say without any filters at all. The history on this, again, is horrific. It was the National Socialists in Germany, the Nazis, who blamed everything that was going wrong in Germany on the Jews of the time, and we saw how that tends to work out.
Yeah, it's definitely another in a long line of American xenophobia. You mentioned, first of all, Chuck Schumer actually mentioned today that we should consider a pause in bringing Syrian refugees in. So it's definitely not just a Republican issue. The Republicans are just more able to frame it as like a war on Islam. You mentioned Donald Trump, and he and several other people said that we should monitor mosques for radicalization. And, we know that's ridiculous because previous programs like the demographic unit here in New York, proved to be completely useless and illegal. But we know there are mosques where people are being radicalized, both here and obviously in France and Belgium. So, Peter, how do we police radicalization without infringing on the rights of every single Muslim person?
Well, first of all, what Donald Trump is talking about, monitoring or closing mosques, is wholly unconstitutional. The First Amendment guarantees freedom of religion, and any kind of blanket surveillance / discrimination / persecution of a religion is unconstitutional. There should be some kind of asterisk in the Constitution.
Yeah,
that
it's not even really. It's not even hypothetical. New York City did try this. Yeah. The demographics unit I just mentioned, 6 years yielded no arrests, no leads, and then it had to be shut down because essentially it's illegal.
Sure. So let's go back and take a look at this. For example, in the 60s and 70s or so, it was believed that organized crime here in New York City was getting out of control. And so there was a campaign launched against the mafia. Now, the New York City police and the FBI did not surveil every Italian in the New York metro area. Instead, what they did was open a series of investigations that helped them narrow down their target list, if you will, obtain warrants, and then focus their limited resources on people who they believed actually were bad guys, and continue to define it until they figured out who they were going to actually go out and arrest. Mosques are one place that Muslims gather, and I think they're very visible places for Muslims to gather, and so it's an easy target for politicians and law enforcement to focus on. But, you can just as easily get together at a McDonald's and make plans. The 9/11 hijackers spent a lot of time in cafes and coffee shops in Germany planning their attacks. So, you can pick a giant group and say all the Muslims, and you can pick a giant group and say all the mosques, but you're going to not accomplish your goals. In fact, there's 14 years worth of evidence that we haven't accomplished those goals. And at the same time, you're going to, at a minimum, piss off a lot of very innocent people, if not radicalize even more people.
Right, but I mean, again, we do know that there are mosques where there are, radical extreme imams, and there are people being radicalized in some of them. How do we try to police that without doing what you said, just unconstitutional violation of rights?
Well, if you're going to go out and catch criminals, then you catch criminals the way that you've always caught criminals. You conduct reasonable investigations that have some sense of probable cause attached to them, and then you proceed from there to determine whether or not a law is being violated and gather evidence against that person. The idea of saying, there may be a mosque in Texas, that has a imam that we think is a radical. First, we can argue about how you define all those terms, but let's just use them for now. And then once you've come to that conclusion, maybe based on an informant, maybe based on an arrest, then you say, fine, what laws are being violated here? And you gather evidence. It's not a complex question. It doesn't require what we're agonizing over here. It's a crime. We know how to deal with crime. We can do that without creating more problems on a secondary or tertiary basis.
I think it's really ironic that the same people who worry that Muslims will create a public safety issue immediately shut down any argument that would curb the biggest violent threat to Americans, which is obviously guns. There was a former NYPD detective on the Sean Hannity show this week who said that we should monitor the mosques, and he added that, let's stop worrying about people's rights. This is a safety issue. Eric, could you imagine someone saying this in a gun debate on Fox News?
Total, entry into the police state where we have no say and the government just busts their door down, checks us. And, if we ever were to fall to that level, we may as well just all grab guns and start shooting the place up, because it will not be worth living in, 1984.
We were talking about mosques being used as a radicalization tool, but it seems like the internet is actually a more effective way to radicalize people, especially outside of ISIS. So how could we maybe curb the radicalization online, again, without infringing on everybody's rights in the process?
Well, you actually can't stop online terrorism in the way that we would like to. If ISIS or whatever terror organization is intelligent about it, there are so many methods that you can hide behind, like the Tor network, other forms of identity masking that in reality you could hide forever. And is as good as an FBI hacker may be, once you hide behind several layers of Tor, you just cannot be found. And if that's what they start doing, then there really is no way to track them.
Peter?
Well, I want to stop and not further demonize encryption. Because encryption is a tool that many of us use to protect ourselves against government intrusion. It arguably could follow the gun control argument. People buy guns to legitimately protect themselves and go hunting, and people use encryption for both legitimate and illegitimate purposes. It's a tool, and I think I bring that up only because John Brennan and others in the American law enforcement community have used the Paris tragedy as an excuse to argue that we should not be allowed to have encryption, that if the NSA the NSA should be able to read anything that's encrypted out there. The cross between safety and freedom is largely at the heart of all of these discussions, and it certainly is in play when you talk about censoring the internet, which is indeed what we're talking about. There are laws that have been in place for a very long time that have served us. If I put up a website saying, kill the pigs, and include in great detail how using police methods you can stalk and assassinate police officers. There are plenty of laws that govern that. And I can be arrested, the website can be shut down, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if I put up a website that says, I hate the police, and I really could care less if bad things happen to them, that is not terrorism. It's not anything. In fact, it falls clearly inside the boundaries of legitimate speech. The same way a governor saying, if we let Syrian refugees into our state, they're going to cause trouble, and that stirs up all the right-wing hatred in his state, and he knows that, and incidents do happen. So if we want to fight ISIS online or anywhere else, we simply have to use the tools that are available, and we have to, more importantly, use persuasive arguments against that radicalization. There's a concept called the gray zone, which posits that a number of, in this case we're talking about Muslims, a number of Muslims exist in a gray zone between two competing forces, those that want to assimilate them and those who want to radicalize them. And that for the majority of Muslims, yeah, they're one, but there's all these people that are caught in this gray zone that we are competing for with ISIS. We have to be very conscious of this, and we have to make sure that we're successfully competing for them, not simply by trying to play whack-a-mole with ISIS Twitter accounts, but in better sense, having a broader society that welcomes them and wants them to assimilate, rather than either a counter-narrative that says, ISIS is bad, stay away from them, or an even stronger counter-narrative that says, you're not wanted in 30 of our 50 states.
Well, I mean, aside from attacking ISIS and the flow of ISIS members into Europe, how do we stop young Muslim men just from being recruited into these terror networks? I mean, we're seeing some staggering numbers out of France and Belgium. Just 440 or more people just from Belgium have fled to fight for ISIS in Syria. Peter, how do we curb the radicalization of, and it's usually, it's the same type of person. It's a young Muslim man who usually comes from a crappy area of town, and he's disillusioned. A lot of them were, we saw a couple of them had, criminal records. Some of them, had Facebook accounts with photos of them drinking. How do we stop these people who aren't naturally going to gravitate towards radical Islam from being drawn into it?
Well, you just said the answer, really, which is to bring them from the opposite of all those positions, the disillusionment and things like that. ISIS offers these folks a number of things that we have to look very deeply into ourselves and say, well, why are those messages resonating with these young people? ISIS offers a religious view, and religion has always been a very powerful motivator to bring people into a fight. Secondarily, ISIS offers an anti-Western and anti-imperialist message, which is also very persuasive. If you are raised as a minority in a Western society, if you are made fun of, if you are told on a regular basis that your religion is one of terrorism, if you see activities where people desecrate your religious books, smear feces on the door of your mosque, as we saw in Texas this week, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, you're denied job opportunities because of the color of your skin or your religion. Well, you become very, very susceptible to an outside message that says we, ISIS, have a solution to your situation. At the same time, we're going to offer you excitement, adventure, your own machine gun, a chance to go play G.I. Joe. Some of those messages are not dissimilar from the same recruitment messages that are used anywhere in the world to draw young people enthusiastically into the military. And those need to be countered. If you can't counter them by making changes in society, you are going to have to understand that disillusioned people are going to step out of society and into an environment where they feel more welcome and can strike back against the people they felt harmed them.
We saw the family of the so-called mastermind of the Paris attacks say that, he was a perfectly normal guy, and then a couple of years ago he traveled to Syria and came back completely different and very radicalized. We saw the three brothers that were involved in the attacks at the stadium. Their families said that, they're totally normal, and then, little by little they changed. How do we stop these people who lead totally normal lives from all of a sudden falling into the call of radical Islam, Eric?
I think if we knew the answer, it would be solved. But I think it starts by instilling role models into those communities where required. That could be in the form of people that, successful Muslims that have accomplished things. It could be helping them get an education and achieve things. In some form, we need to provide these influential people, the people that can be easily influenced, with some form of aid. When they travel to the Middle East, they're shown that when they die, they'll have all the virgins. They're shown guns. They're given money. They're told that they can, succeed and achieve anything as long as they attack the West. We need to stop that from happening in the first place by making them appreciate the West a little more.
And just to go back to the area where these guys were from, at least 3 of the attackers came from this suburb of Brussels called Molenbeek, and some of the people involved in the past attacks and attempts in Paris were also from the same area. The immediate response was to immediately start bombing Raqqa targets, ISIS targets in Raqqa. What can we do to, target these specific types of neighborhoods where it seems like they pose a much bigger threat than any, jihadi in Raqqa might pose to the Europe, Peter?
Well, it sounds like, I apologize, it sounds like the police are coming for me here, which in fact may be the case. I'll try to keep.
Judging by your shirt, you just went through a prison break.
Well, I want to be prepared, so I've dressed the part. But when I was in Iraq, whenever some of the bad guys were captured, their cell phones inevitably had videos on them of the Abu Ghraib pictures. They had videos showing American bombings and things like that. I mean, their inspiration was not hard to figure out. The French strikes against Raqqa shut the city's lights off. They shut the city's water supply off, and are very likely to make life very unpleasant for the 200,000 people who live in that city. Now, of those 200,000, a very small number are actually ISIS people, if you will, but a very large number just came to a new opinion on the West. So the ideas that Eric mentioned are very important and part of a solution, but a larger solution has to be global and has to say, are we contributing to the radicalization? Let's look at Paris. The attacks on Paris were not about killing 150 people. Their deaths are tragic, but that's not what ISIS wanted to do. They weren't hoping to kill 150 or 200 or whatever. They were hoping to kill enough people to bring out the reactions that we, in fact, have seen. Essentially, martial law in Paris, a new commitment by France to get deeper involved in the wars in the Middle East, some hot-ass rhetoric out of the United States, anti-immigrant sentiments here and there. That is what they wanted to accomplish out of that tragedy. And unfortunately, we keep handing the terrorists exactly what they want. Take a look back at 9/11. Bin Laden, we know from the things that he's written and things that he said, thought he was going to provoke the United States to make a attack on Afghanistan, a limited attack on Afghanistan, and he hoped that would inflame enough Muslims to carry his message forward. When the United States turned around with a full-on invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, followed by the invasion of Iraq, followed by a global war on terror, I mean, this is like the terrorist's wet dream. They can't succeed without us, and we have to stop playing into their hands and making it easy for them.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic that all these years have been calling Fox News the conservative propaganda channel. It's inadvertently been functioning as an ISIS propaganda channel. But to touch on some of the things you just said, there's been a number of terrorist attacks since 9/11. We've responded by going to war, by bombing Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Yemen, Libya, Syria. The list is almost endless. After this attack, both the U.S. and France ramped up airstrikes. Russia ramped up airstrikes. When are we going to learn, Eric, that we can't bomb the terrorism problem away? And in some cases, like Peter said, we actually end up creating a lot more terrorists in the process.
Well, I agree that, especially that we do create a lot more terrorists in the process, because by bombing civilians over and over, you're creating new generations of angry people, as Peter was touching on. I don't think we'll ever learn, because our first response when we get hurt is to hurt the person that hurt us even more. And dropping bombs on a country seems a lot easier than fully committing a military, because it's less dangerous and there's a chance for less casualties. So what I would blame actually would be just the modern form of warfare and the idea that airstrikes and drone strikes are the way we conduct it. It's no longer a large-scale conventional warfare that we were used to through, let's say, the 2 world wars and even through some of the smaller wars leading up to the modern era.
Peter, you wrote a bit about this in your article this week. At what point does the West realize that if we bomb them, we hurt the cause more than help it?
I'm not certain at what point that message will get through, if at all. It has been over 14 years of pursuing the exact same strategy. And it would be extremely difficult for even the most sympathetic person to that strategy to argue that we're better now than we were then, that we've got less threat facing us, that there's less terrorism in the world, that fewer parts of the world are controlled by terrorists or ungoverned space that are sort of waiting to start growing terrorists. Libya and Yemen are the examples that come right to mind. That used to be stable areas and now are ungoverned spaces. Syria, of course, is a perfect example. You go back 4 years, 5 years, and Syria was a perfectly stable place, and look at it now. If you can't learn the lesson in 14 years with all of these separate examples under 2 administrations, it's entirely unclear to me how that lesson can possibly be learned in the future. Certainly looking at the likely presidential candidates, Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side, she was strongly in support of the attacks on Libya, which created that mess. She strongly was in support of wider military action in Syria. The Republicans, as we've talked about here, are absolutely batshit crazy, falling over each other to talk about how much of a larger fight they can create. So the lessons haven't been learned in 14 years, and I don't see any possibility for the next, say, 8 years that any lessons will be learned. At that point, we're locked into this, essentially a cycle of perpetual war and perpetual terrorism.
You were in Iraq in 2009 when we were still, rebuilding. And it seemed like, it was a very different war. We didn't just bomb the crap out of them when we invaded and tried to rebuild and create a democracy and capitalism and all that. What went so wrong that now you have 2 countries that didn't have terrorism before, in Iraq and Syria, they're now overrun by these gigantic, huge militias?
Well, Iraq is a little different in the sense that it was an artificial construct. We can go all the way back to a quick lesson in the history of the Ottoman Empire and everything else like that. But the idea was that it was an artificial construct of Sunni Shias and Kurds that was held together by a strongman government and a secret police force. We busted that all apart and never quite figured out what to do about it after that. That set off these dominoes falling, the rise of Sunni power in the Middle East, the interest of Shias to band together with Iran and Kurdish independence and all these other things. It's essentially a problem that the United States has failed to really understand, that these are not sort of countries in the traditional sort of World War II sense, where we invade Germany and blow up Berlin, and then we capture their flag and win. They are an amalgam of tribes and allegiances and religious groups and what have you. You can't, and they partner with each other, and they fuss with each other, and they fight with each other on a fluid basis. It's not a chessboard. There aren't moves and counter moves. To drag the analogy, I'm afraid, further out, it's like six-dimensional chess, and you don't even understand the rules that the other side is playing on. At some point, the question arises that if you don't know the game, if you don't know the rules, and the other side appears to be sort of good at it, at what point do you realize it's not your game, and you need to question strongly, why are you involved in the Middle East? What is America's fight there? And whether we still need to even be there doing whatever it is we think we're doing.
Well, just as an aside, I remember in 2008 when Joe Biden was running for president, he was talking about that exact thing, maybe splitting Iraq up into 3 different countries based on, tribal associations. ISIS at the end of the day is a temporary problem, whereas the Sunni-Shiite clash is never going anywhere. Do you think in the future that Iraq will end up, splintering into 3 countries? And if so, do you think that the U.S. should just stay out of that and let that happen? Or do you think that we should undo the mistakes that the West created in the first place?
Well, first of all, the question of whether or not Iraq is going to break into 3 countries, in a way, has already been de facto answered. It is 3. We won't call them countries. They're not going to have teams in the Olympics for quite some time. But I mean, I'll call them statelets, for lack of a better word. That's already happened. Whether we wanted it to happen, or whether we admit it happened, or whatever you want to say, there are 3 separate statelets there. Kurdistan is, in fact, a fully autonomous region. It's got its own army, its own government. It uses its own currency. I mean, they're everything short of an Olympic team. Shia Iraq is strongly allied with the Iranians and has a very defined physical space that they control. There's inter-Shia issues which are separate from all this. And the Sunnis keep being squeezed further and further west towards Syria, and currently have ISIS sort of fighting on their side. But as you pointed out, ISIS is a temporary thing. It would be replaced by something, the sons of ISIS or what have you. At this point, if the United States wanted to do anything at all, and I'm certainly not advocating that, I'm advocating the United States step away from all this and let the interested parties work it out. But if the United States wanted to do anything at all, the job would be to manage the process of dissolution, to manage the rebordering, and to kind of lessen the chance that this will all just spill into chaos to create, again, these ungoverned spaces which encourage terrorism. We could, for example, look for ways to buffer the Sunnis and the Shias in Iraq. We could look for ways to see where the natural fault lines between Sunni Syria/Iraq and currently the Iraqi borders are, and see if we can't help define that area and keep these forces apart from one another. Instead, we're sort of fighting all of them at the same time, and the results speak for themselves.
We were everyone in the media is obsessed with the Paris attack, but it's one of just a few terrorist attacks that's occurred in just the last week. We had one in Beirut, we had one in Kenya. Just today, we had one in Nigeria, killed more than 30 people. We didn't even make that big of a fuss when more than 200 Russian people died on the airliner in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Eric, why the big disconnect? Why do we care about this terrorist attack but don't care about the terrorist attack that killed even more people just the week before, or the one that happened the day before in Beirut?
I mean, it very simply boils down to prejudice, racism. Essentially,
Russians are still white, right?
No, not really, though. Well, okay, yes, they're white, but in terms of historically, it's the East. It's part of the old communist bloc. Russia was always kind of on the edge and never really seen as part of the West unless you go back to, the era of Peter the Great or Catherine the Great, whenever they were maybe trying to Westernize. But in modern day, if it's not the West, it's not news. And that's sad. But I mean, how many people die on a daily basis in Africa to the warlords, to terrorist groups? We don't even see anything about it. But the moment one Western country gets attacked, it's all over the news. It's all we're talking about. And I think it speaks volumes to how our society approaches violence and how it's only important if it happens to us.
I don't know if there was nothing about it. I mean, there was definitely quite a lot of coverage of the Beirut attacks leading up to Paris. Same. But do you think that it's a media issue, or do you think that the media puts it out there, they don't see a response, and so they stop? We live in a click economy. We work in the click economy. We see what's happening, and when Paris is getting a lot of clicks, we're going to stick with Paris. Do you think it's people or media?
Well, I think it's people. I think as a society, we just don't care as much as we should about the third world. It's one thing, to see an advertisement on TV about sending $1 a day to Africa or the violence, but in the end, we don't care. We tune out to what's going on over there because it doesn't affect our daily lives. France seems a lot more approachable because their culture may be slightly different, but they're a majority white country. They're Western in nature, the birthplace of, let's say, freedom and democracy in some sense. And so we see them as a lot more like us, whereas when we look at a poor African country with rundown villages, no drinking water, it's just not the same. To us, it seems like another planet almost.
Peter, isn't that the problem? We disregard the massive attacks and deaths in the Middle East and Northern Africa, and then we turn around and we're like, how could this happen, right in our back door in Paris?
It adds to the ISIS anti-imperialist, anti-Western narrative. That narrative says that the only thing that matters to the West is Western aims. And when non-Western people die, or when people the West doesn't really particularly care about, like the Russians die, it's just a blip on the radar screen. I mean, as you pointed out, the White House didn't light up in the colors of the Soviet flag, even though almost twice as many Russians died in the air crashes as died in
over
Paris.
220 people, yeah.
Yeah. So if you want to take it another half step, there's a darker explanation that's worth considering, and that is when you look at the way our government seeks to manipulate these events. For example, what happened in Paris means that we can't have encryption in the United States because if the terrorists didn't use encryption, they'll certainly use encryption next time. The way this gets manipulated, it works a whole lot better the more similar the victims are to ourselves, the more we can project ourselves into that tragedy. And so people in the United States can't project themselves into a tragedy in Beirut. They can't project themselves into a tragedy in Nigeria. And, Russians are different. We don't like them. And the majority of Americans grew up under the communist threat and all that other stuff. So it's easy to kind of push them aside and dismiss them. But with Paris, we can project ourselves right into that disaster. And in fact, one American was killed in Paris. And that becomes then to emotionalize the issue. Once you've got people inflamed emotionally, they become malleable. You can kind of put thoughts into their head and push them any direction you want to. And I suspect there are, in addition to the racist elements that Eric correctly brought up, I'm afraid that there are some very cold-hearted calculations that go into how these events can be used to manipulate our own society.
Well, yeah. Ann Coulter said immediately after the attack that Donald Trump just won himself the election. And, I don't know about Trump, but does the terrorism threat being reawakened more or less, since they haven't talked about terrorism up until now in the debates, is this going to help the Republicans because they seem to be the ones that Americans turn to in times where their security is threatened? Peter?
We'll see how this plays out. First of all, we do have, almost a whole year before the elections, and there's
only a couple months of the primaries.
Fair enough. A couple of months in the primaries. I think both sides profit politically from having this kind of emotional issue to kick around. I mean, I'm sure 99% of Americans say we don't want more terrorism, whereas Americans are hopelessly divided over economic issues and the social issues that we talk about often here in terms of gun control. So both sides love to have one of these red, white, and blue. We call them apple pie issues in politics. Nobody can oppose them. The Republicans do have an advantage that they are fearless about bringing these things up in the most bombastic ways possible. And so I would say, yeah, I would give them a bit of an advantage over all this, only because they will be shameless in further emotionalizing the issues. Americans want blood, and the Republicans are happy to promise it to them. Yeah, I'll give them some extra points right now.
Well, I think
I can make a quick point.
One second. I think that they will tap into that xenophobic base with those comments, but I think traditionally, voters have gone towards Republicans in times of war. And Eric, do you think that Hillary Clinton, being the kind of hawk that she is actually can help the Democrats kind of level the playing field on that, or do you think the Republicans are just going to own this security issue the rest of the way?
I think the Republicans will own it mainly because, as Peter was saying, they can speak very violently about it and get away with it. One example
that appeals to the base. I don't think that appeals to the general electorate.
You don't think so? How so?
I don't think, when you look around at the states that have gone through with it, I think most of the states that don't want to ban, or the governors haven't said we're going to ban refugees, I think they support those governors' decision. And I think in a lot of the states where some of the governors in purple states that have gone towards that direction will also see some backlash.
But see, I recall, at least I was a little young when 9/11 happened, but the moment it happened, it was all about fear-mongering and selling the idea that terrorism was coming and that we needed defense from it. And I think if you look at Donald Trump as an example, if you go back 1 or 2 months ago in the campaign, he said he loved Muslim people, that he had no issues with them. Suddenly Paris happens, and now keep the Syrians out. I hate Muslims. They're the terrorists. Look at mosques. And now it's changed his tune, and people are letting him get away with it, and they're starting to give him support. Some of the post-Paris polls are showing that Trump has increased in the numbers, and it's for him, he's perfectly capitalizing on this strategy and using it to his advantage and to push his campaign further. And I think the Republicans will get away with that because it's almost assumed that they're going to take those stances. And now that there's a tragedy to fuel it, it's acceptable in some forms, although it shouldn't be, but it is.
Well, I think the difference is that, Al Gore, John Kerry, these are guys that the Republican Party can easily kind of make look like, a bunch of pussies. I don't think you could do that with Hillary Clinton. Do you think Hillary Clinton has a bit of a leg up on someone like John Kerry when it comes to this?
Only if she's willing to stand up, though, and take those aggressive stances. She has to be careful because if she goes too far right, then she may alienate some left voters. And until the nomination happens, like we're assuming one that Hillary Clinton wins, if she takes a stance too soon, some of the Dem voters could switch over to Sanders, seeing him as maybe a better alternative to avoid a war situation.
Peter, we've seen Hillary and Bernie try to outdo each other to the left on economic issues. Come general election, do you think that, presumably she's going to win, and whoever comes out of the Republican Party will try to outright each other on security and defense issues?
First of all, I'm going to just say how disappointed I am that the question that you asked, Eric, which involved calling Democrats pussies and then bringing Hillary Clinton up.
Not Democrats, John Kerry and Al Gore. was
not given to me. I'll just express some personal regret there. The primaries are different than the general election in the same way that we're always mentioning how the Republicans turn up the crazy to 11 during their primaries and then have to dial it back for the general election. Well, Hillary, to a certain extent, given that her challenger here, Bernie Sanders, is so far to her left, she's got to be careful too. She's got to turn her left side up, if you will, a little more in the primary process than she will in the general election. I think, though, that absent any other serious terror attacks, because if you get another big one, especially if it affects Americans, then the gloves are off and every candidate is going to be screaming for blood. But I think assuming that nothing severely happens that involves Americans, Hillary's got some real problems going into the general election. First of all, the Republicans will tie her as closely as possible to Obama, who they have created a narrative as being weak and feckless in the face of these threats. True or not, they have been successful in painting that picture, and they'll tie her to that, and she'll be stuck trying to figure out whether she should back off of Obama or keep attached to him and things like that. Second, she can't make up her mind how she wants to characterize her vote in favor of the Iraq invasion. She tries to step away from it as much as possible, but at the same time, she could be using it as an example of, hey, when we need to go to war, I'm all in favor of it. But instead, she's sort of pissing off both sides. The third issue is going to be Libya, where she was strongly in favor of military intervention in Libya, but it turned out really badly. And she's still pussyfooting around the idea that Libya turned out so badly. In the last debate, she was blathering about how they had an election and then some bad things happened. And next question, please. So her dithering about whether she is hawkish or not, or a little right of center, is going to harm her, I think, when she gets to the general election. The Republicans will be on every one of those inconsistencies, like a hawk on a rat. And Hillary, being the way she is, will basically dither around and give them more to work with on every opportunity. She's going to really need to cover her flank on this issue.
Eric, it's very difficult to compare because the Canadian election was before the Paris attacks, and Canada is a very different country from the U.S. But, Stephen Harper came out strong against, a lot of Muslim Canadians, and on the other hand, Justin Trudeau did the opposite, and even now has pulled, his support for the airstrikes out. Do you think that the Muslim issue is what hurt Harper, or do you think it was just a combination of, just incompetence?
Well, if we're delving into Canadian politics, Harper's legacy was mainly his downfall, because he waited too long to do anything for, almost, I guess, was it 8 or 10 years he was in? Not much was accomplished. Sure, he maybe had the economy remain stable through the recession, but so did almost
but
most
you
of the
kept
West.
re-electing him until just a month ago.
Because, if you want to really go into it, the opposition candidates were terrible through those years. They were virtually plants. A plant would have been a better choice to elect than any of them. But we won't go into detail them because, it would be a whole podcast on its own.
Is Justin Trudeau going to rejoin the West in their war on ISIS, or no more airstrikes,
No, I don't
period?
think so. Well, we were talking earlier about how the idea of striking back with bombs is the wrong response, and I think maybe Trudeau understands that. It won't be effective because, unfortunately, the rest of West will still be dropping bombs, but I think he understands that it's a situation that has to play itself out, and Western meddling won't solve it.
Forget about, presidents, prime ministers, all that. 30 plus states went to try to ban refugees. Guess who most of those governors are? Are we going to see, we've seen the rise of the right before, and we're certainly seeing it now in Europe as well. Do you think that we're going to have another tide of these hard-line conservatives coming in these coming congressional elections?
I don't think necessarily. For example, Jeb Bush had the correct response. He's a Republican, but he came out with a moderate response saying that we shouldn't ban refugees and we should do what's right as a world leader. And I think
Jeb Bush is running for national office, though. badly, but he's running. I'm talking about the ones that have to win the small district elections that have to win. What's that?
I thought we were talking ideologically.
No, but I'm saying it's going to be a lot easier for someone with Donald Trump's stance to win a small county in Alabama and become a congressperson, or even the state of Alabama and become a senator, than it would be for Donald Trump to ever win the general election on the shit he says.
But I think that more than anything boils down to the cultures within those small areas. That's acceptable behavior to say, fuck Muslims, fuck terrorists. That's acceptable behavior, unfortunately, and that's something that everybody can get behind. Yeah, those Muslims, they bombed us in New York, 9/11, let's fuck them. That's okay because they accept that there. But if something like that was maybe in California, you wouldn't see that flying because people there are a little more open-minded, a little more social towards the issues. And until we address, the wounds in America where we have these kind of racist pockets, they're going to exist, and there's nothing we can do, and racist officials will get elected on those platforms because they're appealing to the people.
Peter, we saw the rise of the Tea Party. Not that the Tea Party wasn't xenophobic, but they were largely, the ideology was built on economic issues. Do you think we're going to see like maybe not a neocon, but a hardline wave of these conservatives who just want to bomb everything and everybody come in like we saw the Tea Party a few years ago?
I think so. I mean, a good example is, again, these 30-some governors who were saying they don't want Syrian refugees. They know they have no means of keeping them out. They know that what they're talking about is not lawful and, in fact, impossible to do. But they're saying it anyway because it plays to their smaller audience. They don't have to worry about what people in California might think. They're worried about what people in Kentucky think, and they can focus on these issues. Demagoguery is a long American political tradition. And politicians are very, very good at sort of sniffing out people's prejudices. Let's not forget that within our extended lifetimes, you had people running for office in the South who openly used the N-word to describe black citizens who had the right to vote. And who actively campaigned on their skills at preventing African Americans from participating in civic life. That's not something that happened hundreds of years ago. That's something that happened 50 years ago in the United States. And so once you get one of these people who stands up and says, your prejudices and hatreds are valid, he or she really can quickly attract an audience. The whole Fox network is basically built on that theory. And it's a dark side of America. It's a side that I don't like to see, and events like what happened in Paris just bring that thing right up to the forefront.
All right. Well, this was go ahead, Eric.
Well, I was going to say, it doesn't just happen in America. I mean, there was that crazy guy in Montreal that was wearing a Joker mask saying you would kill an Arab a week. It happens everywhere, unfortunately, just because we've been trained almost, if that's the word, to look at Muslims in the Middle East as this evil population that's scheming to destroy us.
Well, is it that big a difference, this terrorism issue and, the mass shooting issue that we have here by the guys similar to the one Eric just mentioned, the Joker guy? If it's not an Arab, he's going to have other enemies. We saw the guy try to kill people in California because girls didn't like him. We saw the guy in South Carolina shoot up a church. We saw a guy go into a movie theater in Louisiana for no goddamn reason. We kill so many more Americans than terrorists ever could dream of doing. Why are we so focused? I mean, obviously, they killed a lot more people in Paris, and you can kill a lot more people in a terrorist attack like the one in Egypt, like the one in Madrid, and of course 9/11, which is the only really big one to happen here. But we have 3 times as many, or 4 times as many people killed each year as were killed on 9/11.
It's, once again, it boils down to racism and the imagery of the terrorist, the guy with the head wrap on, the big
black
beard.
people and Mexican people and Muslim people shoot people too.
Yes, no, of course, I'm not denying that. But if you put up 3 pictures and you say which one's the enemy, most people are going to point at the terrorist, and that's just the way we've been trained through, media constantly talking about it. The idea of the wars, the idea that they attack us in vulnerable ways. Sure, we have our own mass shootings. But for whatever reason, if you say a mass shooting or 9/11, everybody's going to see 9/11 or even the Paris attack as something that's more aggravating and something that we want to stop, but we can't. And so it galvanizes people to be angry and to look at the Middle East as this big problem.
I think we should start bombing angry white men in America. They're obviously the most significant threat to us. Look, it's racism, and it's the need for a handy, convenient, recognizable bully. If you go back and look, for example, look at Hollywood movies over the last, say, 70 years since World War II, and who the sort of prime villains were. The Germans were in some of these movies, but once the Japanese came along, man, they made much better villains, and they had a much more staying power, and the portrayals were far more racist. Once we got to the Cold War, the Russians had a good run all through the James Bond movies and a lot of our war movies. There was a gap where we weren't sure who the bad guys were, and they kept trying to fill it in with North Koreans or evil masterminds, Dr. Evil kind of characters. But boy, once 9/11 happened, we had it. It was the Muslims, and it was great. You could put a headscarf on them and put some shoe polish to darken up their skin, hand them an AK-47, and bang, instant villain. It's great to have that, and it portrays, I think, our narrow-mindedness and our almost pathological desire to blame anyone but ourselves for what's happening to us.
You're exactly right, though, because having studied the Cold War through university, basically the United States has always had to have an enemy. And as Peter was saying, first it was the Germans, then it was the Japanese, then the Russians, then there was the Gap, then it was the Muslim population. And this is something that you can easily see through almost the entire history of the country. If you even go further back than that, you have at a certain point the British, of course. So the idea that the United States always needs an enemy is relevant. It exists. And for now, the Muslims are such an easy target because they know how to antagonize the West, especially through these terror attacks. Whether these terror attacks are relevant and need this much exposure, they're an easy way to piss the West off and to get us, into the fight, unfortunately.
Well, I think a simpler explanation would be, car crashes kill thousands more people than plane crashes ever will, but, which one do people fear getting into most? Anyway,
this was shiny.
Exactly. This was a dismaying conversation. I need to go have a shower. Next week, Josh will be back, and hopefully we'll talk about some happier things like cop shootings or something.
Bob Ross, happy trees.
Yes. All right. Thanks for tuning in. Keep reading Latest.com.